Welcome to the first invited talk. You all know Florian, so I'm going to keep my presentation really brief. Florian graduated from UMass Amherst in 2009, and he's currently an associate professor in law. His main interests are informal semantics, mathematics, and his work in this area often incorporates psycholinguistics methods. His current research focuses mainly on definiteness, presupposition, and scholarly literatures, and some of his publications, well, recent ones and the ones related to definiteness, are false but slow, evaluating statements with no referring definites, how weak and how definite are weak definites, different types of definites for linguistically, and of course his dissertation, we all know it, but still, two types of definites in natural languages. So, well, his dissertation proposes the existence of two types of definites. In German, the definites are definite articles, one weak and one strong, and he argues that each one of these articles corresponds to one of the two predominant theoretical approaches to definite descriptions, namely uniqueness and familiarity. He further suggests that the weak article encodes the uniqueness, while the strong article is anaphoric in nature, and this proposal, which is very, very elegantly worked out in terms of dynamic and situation semantics, makes a very important prediction, which is already captured in the title of his dissertation, which is, of course, that there are at least two types of definite articles in natural languages. So before just passing the mic to him, we, the organizers, Violeta, Anna, Samuel, and myself, want to thank Florian for accepting to come to Mexico City and to this workshop. For us, it's really, really nice to have you here. We have a monthly seminar on definiteness. That's where the idea of this workshop actually came about. So for us, it's really an honor to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the, this is my document, is that good? Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful workshop. It's been already a great day of talks. Thank you also to all of you for hanging in there after a long day and an opulent lunch. I had some time to recover at least. So yes, this talk is not about the definite article because that's added presupposition failure in it. I'm going to talk about weak versus strong definite articles, so I argue we need to differentiate these things, and what I'm trying to do here in the talk is to sort of spell out in a more extensive way, building on lots of work, parts of which will be represented in the coming days, looking across languages to what extent we can sort of make sense of contrast between different types of definite articles and definite descriptions, along the lines of what I proposed in my dissertation. So there's been, right, as we see, and as the success of this workshop already documents, there's lots of work on languages that have more than one form to express definiteness. And from the cross-linguistic perspective, right, which is our motto here for the workshop, I think there's at least two very central questions that we want to get at. First of all, what variation do we find in form with respect to how these mean contrasts are expressed? And what different definite descriptions are expressed within languages. And secondly, we want to ask whether there's any variation in meaning, and specifically for the topic of today in terms of the contrast in meaning that we find in particular cases. All of this has lots of broader implications as well that I'm not really going to get into today. This bears crucially on the role of context and interpretation, on mechanisms for quantification or covariation in natural language, and of course, as we've already heard a bit about today, noun phrase structure. So the plan for today is I'll give a brief review of the contrast between weak versus strong articles in German and Germanic. Note here, there's a lot of talk of weak and strong, of course, and there's a bit of unfortunate terminological confusion in the sense that these terms are used in multiple ways. I try to stick to talking about weak article definites rather than just weak definites, which I also take to be the thing that Nina talked about first. Okay. So I'll sketch the analysis I presented, and then I'll do some cross-linguistic exploration, or what Barry Schein in a paper that he just posted called, I'm handling some stumbling with purpose to find things across languages. I thought that was a fun way of putting it, so we'll stumble on words with purpose and find interesting things. So we'll first look a little bit at variation in form, and then a little bit more extensively at variation in the meaning contrast to the extent that it exists. First, I'll try to convince you that there's relatively little in that regard, and then we'll come to some cases that will make life a little bit harder and will keep us all busy working for another decade or so trying to make sense of these impairments. One possibility is that there is an additional dimension of variation, that there are some languages that exhibit an entirely different contrast, even though it may look somewhat similar at first. The alternative would be that there's a more gradient analysis that we need, and then we'll have to come up with a suitable version of that. Very briefly, this is more or less common ground here already. The holy grail in the study of definite descriptions, for the most part, has been to come up with one unified theory that gets everything right about English stuff. At least that's where the philosophical tradition comes from. That would be the economical thing to do, highly efficient, have one theory. So there's two highly prominent types of those. One unified attempt is trying to explain it all in terms of uniqueness. The table is covered with books, works, and context, whether it's exactly one table. And then, of course, we run into challenges of trying to explain where it works, even though there are as many tables in the world, but it still has to be limited in some way. So to what extent does it use it? Secondly, there's the notion that definite descriptions are inherently anaphoric. This is sort of the basic notion involved in dynamic theories. So that in one way or another, a definite, like the table, always winds up linking back to an antecedent of some sort or another, in the prototypical case at least to a linguistic antecedent like N1 prime here. The challenge there, of course, is how to rule in all the cases where you don't have that explicit linguistic antecedent and how to make art of it. In my dissertation, as was already said in that introduction, my line of argument is that we do indeed need both types of analyses, and that in fact we find languages exhibiting phenomena that suggest that different types of definite descriptions make use of these different ways of bringing about definiteness. That renders a theoretically more complex picture, but I would argue a empirically more adequate one. Okay, so briefly introducing this notion, there's a very rich descriptive literature, quite a tradition, and kind of interesting how the descriptive tradition and the formal traditions took a long time to really connect. So lots of this work has been on different Germanic dialects or Germanic languages. I list a few here. A very nice case and a very early case that is very well described is the case of Fähring, a Frisian dialect, where there's two entire paradigms of definite articles, which Ebert, who wrote a dissertation on this, calls the A article and the article. So just to give you a sense of this, here's the paradigm for that. Now, in standard German, I argue, there's something very similar going on. It's just a little bit more hidden in that it only arises in certain configurations. So we have this phenomenon where with certain prepositions, and particularly English being met, you can have both the variants zu dem Haus and zum Haus as illustrated here. And the question is, well, what's going on with these two options, and do they differ in any way? Descriptively, what seems to be going on with these two forms seems very similar or identical to what's argued for in Fähring by Ebert, and so I will therefore differentiate these two cases, and in German refer to them again as involving the weak article and the strong article, and I'll mostly stick to that common terminology just for consistency, even going on towards languages that have pair forms of expressing these, and just using it as a cover term for all the elements. Okay, most importantly, for our purposes, there is actually a meaning-related contrast with respect to the two different forms. So the sentence in 4, I'll just read the English because I have too much data from too many languages to consider it all in detail. But so today's cabinet meeting, a new proposal by the Chancellor is expected. Here you can only get the contracted form involving the weak article, and the strong article is out. The weak article becomes unavailable if you switch to the just out one word from Chancellor to Minister, a cabinet member. And the idea here is that well, there's only one chancellor in the cabinet and uniqueness works out, but there's many other cabinet members or ministers. And so this suggests then that the weak article does require uniqueness. How does the strong article in the non-contracted forms work? Well, here, the very same sentence I just showed you before with the strong article now in 6b is perfectly fine if you have an indefinite antecedent in a preceding sentence. There's other ways of making it work as well, but this is kind of, I would say, the hallmark case of making this case work. So these two articles differ then in the way that they relate to their context. The weak article comes with uniqueness requirement, while the strong article is categorically dependent on antecedent in some form or another. This cannot be strictly put in terms of linguistic antecedent, so there's some further things to be said there, but nonetheless, I use the term metaphorically in important uses. Now, there's lots of other uses of definite descriptions that make our lives hard. Here we have some varieties of bridging, long discussed in the literature. These are things like John was driving down the street, the steering wheel was cold, that's clearly about the steering wheel of the car that he was driving. So there's some relation to the context, but it's not clear exactly how it's working out. Similarly, John bought a book today, the author's French. And an interesting question that is, how do these sorts of cases map onto the German article contrast? And interestingly, what we find is that there seem to be different subcases of what has often been referred to as with one label of bridging, some of which require the weak article. So the hallmark case I discussed here are these sort of part-whole relations, like the fridge was so big that the pumpkin could easily be stowed in the crisper, but the crisper is a unique part of the fridge. And there you get the weak article in 9, and in 10 you get the strong article when you have the relationship between an author and, I guess in this case, a play, not a book, but I'll refer to these often as sort of book-author type cases because they seem to function in a very uniform way. Now, a very important point, I'm not going to go into all the technical details here in the interest of time, but an important point that I try to make is that all of these contrasts do also arise in not only in sort of purely referential configurations where the definite does indeed pick up some particular individual, but also in covariant interpretations under quantification. And I think that's important because it tells us that there's not just some general level contextual pragmatic thing that we're looking at, but this has to be something that interacts in a more direct way with the actual grammatical mechanisms for how covariation is implemented. So just a rough sketch here of the analysis that I propose. The core definite article encodes basically Freudian uniqueness relativized to situations in order to ensure domain restriction. And this is basically what the weak article denotation amounts to. The strong article on my analysis is that plus something else, namely an anaphoric element that is essentially a silent pronoun in the structure. And the bridging effects then can also be nicely explained in terms of different ways of mapping the different cases, either based on the situation structure or the specific relational nature of the noun, like author, in these different cases. And as I said before, we need two different ways then of implementing covariation with definites to make both of these cases work. So just to flesh things out a little bit more here, this is the kind of analysis that I proposed. You see immediately that the strong article on the left here is kind of the weak article plus something added on. So we have the article, the situation pronoun, and then the noun phrase. And in the case of the strong article, we have the additional index present as an argument that's introduced on this analysis by the definite article. Note that uniqueness in the simple cases does go away under that analysis, but it does kind of rear its head again in the book author type cases when you have these relational nouns functioning in a particular way. I don't have that illustrated here, but it's an important point to me. So again, core features, so uniqueness plays an essential role, and we need this relativization to a situation pronoun that is introduced on my analysis with the determiner. That's independent arguments arguing that that's the level where these things are introduced. And the two mechanisms for giving rise to covariation with these different types of definites, on the one hand, are based on quantification over situations for the weak article cases, and then through some version of dynamic binding where necessary in the strong article cases. There's also some implications for broader analysis of domain restriction, but I'm not going to get into this. So that's, in a nutshell, basically the proposal that I made. There are some more recent developments that I think are quite interesting, and I want to at least briefly mention them. In particular, Emily Hannig at the University of Chicago, partly in collaboration with Julian Grove, has developed alternative approaches of dealing with the German article contrast that tries to simplify the story and the semantics by saying there's really just one article, and then adding all the additional pieces in the structure. As you saw, I have two different denotations for the definite article, which you may or may not find sort of unpalatable. There's certainly something to be said for this kind of simplification. This is work in progress. I think it's quite interesting. However, it also gives rise to a number of questions. For example, what do you do with languages that have two entire full article paradigms? Hannig's analysis of the German cases quite crucially depends on whether or not contraction happens. I don't know how that extends directly to cases where you have two different forms all across the board. Another interesting point, just skipping to the last bullet here, is interesting work by Milan Rubic on GAMO provides some interesting evidence where sort of you have definite and indefinite morphemes playing together, as it seems, in a very interesting way. That her analysis for those is on the right track. It seems to me, at least, that also favors a truly sort of ambiguity analysis where there's really different lexical entries for these. So I'm not going to get into these things. I just want to mention some recent developments. Here's another slide that I'll hardly say anything about. It's just a huge can of worms trying to figure out just how relative clauses of various types interact with this article contrast. There is some progress here and some interesting contributions in the recent literature, but I'm going to just basically leave these aside for now. And that is because I want to make sure that we have time to get right to the major theme here, namely how what I proposed for German relates to other types of languages. So let's look at definiteness across languages, in particular this weak versus strong article contrast. I take the main empirical questions here to be, first of all, what other languages, if any, employ the same or similar types of contrasts? What variation exists in the formal expression of the contrast? So what are the means that the languages employ to actually work this out? And then secondly, or thirdly, I guess, what variation do we find, if any, in terms of the semantics and pragmatics of the contrast? And I'll spend a good bit of time towards the end of the talk on that third point. To give you sort of a preview of the general picture presented here, first I'm going to lay things out nicely and make things look pretty a little bit by showing you that there is actually quite substantial uniformity across a whole bunch of languages that seem to, through very different means, do draw exactly the same distinction in very subtle ways, parallel to what I've already had from German and what's also happening in theory, etc. Right? There is some very interesting variation in the form in terms of how the contrast is expressed, and that I think is actually quite crucial, studying that and understanding that better, for really getting at the interplay of the formal and the semantic ingredients to really understand what this whole distinction is about in terms of the full syntax semantics picture. Again, in this first batch of languages I'll look at, the variations in meaning and use are really quite minor, and we get a strikingly uniform picture. But of course, life is never that simple, at least not when we study language. There's at least a one particular case, and perhaps a whole class of languages that exhibit what seems to be quite possibly a different type of contrast, which we might want to approach by assuming that there's actually some other dimension of variation, and that the contrast actually works in different ways. However, taking into account even further, more recent work, and some of which we'll hear more about at this workshop here, there's sort of maybe evidence for even further gradients, and I'm honestly not sure exactly how best to deal with it, and we'll leave that open for discussion and trying to work things out in the future. The main theoretical questions that we're after answering here are, of course, well, what is the best analysis that allows for variation as necessary, or perhaps a combination of different pieces of analysis, if it is sort of different dimensions in which these contrasts differ from one another. If we go that route, I think it's also important to ask if there are multiple contrasts, how those are related, if at all. Right? So that's another important piece to understand. So now for the sort of nicely uniform part, right, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of languages that seem to exhibit pretty much exactly the same subtle contrast. Of course, there's a caveat here in terms of not all of these have been studied to the same extent, and there may be further complications that we're glossing over here. But by and large, things look strikingly similar. If we group them formally, there's really two systematic distinctions that are being drawn. There's one, on the one hand, the languages that make an explicit overt contrast between two overt forms, and then another, quite large, apparently, class of languages has a contrast between bare nouns used as definites of a certain sort and overt forms on the other hand. So, just to give you a sort of a general overview of what languages are involved, so all of the Germanic stuff that I alluded to earlier, I'm not citing it again here, falls into this category where in one way or another we do have an overt contrast. Then some more recent cases, recent graduate at Penn looked at this in Icelandic. I'll show you a little bit of data on that, where there's also an overt contrast. And possibly House and Lakota also fall into this, at least, although those are clearly cases I would want to know more about before I do certain things. Then a by now quite substantial list of languages making a distinction between bare versus overtly definite marked noun phrases include the following. So the case of Akan, very well studied by Arkwood and Mathieson. Korean, there's been some really interesting work also on second language acquisition of English that bears on the article contrast. Mauritian Creole is an interesting, well-studied case, a very good dissertation by Johannes Westwood. Czech, Thai Mandarin, Upper Silesian, and Upper Sorbian, the case of Ngano that I mentioned earlier, that I already learned about quite recently. And then two cases that are sort of currently under investigation by two other students at Penn. They're actually here and will present their stuff in the coming days, so we'll look forward to that, and I'll try to not give away too much about this. So to give you, right, again, a feeling of what this uniformity and the contrast looks like, I'll give you a whole bunch of languages with pairs of examples that seem to exhibit the same type of contrast. I try to stick as closely as possible to these rigid contrasts, partly because those are sort of the most subtle and perhaps also the most surprising cases that you would find languages choosing to go different ways there, and the fact that all these languages line up in pretty much the same way seems important to note. And beyond that, though, as to the best of my knowledge, for these cases that I'm talking about, the same contrast also extends to the more standard anaphoric, straightforward anaphoric cases, and on the one hand, and the uniquest cases on the other hand. Okay, so the case of Akan, you have the data on the handout. I don't have time to go through all of this in great detail, so I'm just going to fly through this. I'll read some of the English glosses to give you a feeling. So we saw an old building in the village. The roof was worn out. That in Akan has to involve a bare noun phrase for roof. It can have either the familiarity marker nu or another, what they analyze as a referential definite article be here. And in contrast, the sort of correlate they give for the author book type cases, the dance was so beautiful that the chief gave the trainer a gift. Here we get the definite marker or familiarity marker, as they call it, nu for that case. Mauritian Creole, another case where you have a contrast between bare and overt. This is a French-based Creole, so you immediately notice if you look at the bottom right, use of la. This is directly derived, but very different from the French source. So similar type of example, we have visited the village, the town hall was higher than the church. Again, these are cases where you have to use the bare forms, you do not use the la, but our versions thereof, whereas with the book author type on the bottom here, you do use la. American Sign Language, we find something similar with this index that's been talked about a lot recently, and David will tell you more about that tomorrow, so I'll skip right ahead. Korean, again, a case that I've learned more about fairly recently, has a contrast between, also between bare forms and something that is very commonly glossed as a demonstrative, but note that unlike English that, it also is something that is quite commonly used in cases that arguably are very similar to the book author type, cases. So here they have Jonathan, who read for 3 hours last night and found the novel interesting. So there's this indirect relation back that happens to involve an anaphoric link of some sort. A numeral classifier language, Chi, reported on by work by Peter Jenks. Here we find a contrast between cases of just bare nouns versus noun phrases with classifiers and a demonstrative like I didn't last year's that, and you get the pattern. These are basically the same types of examples. We're switching to Congo, but that's better. Now, Icelandic is formally an interesting case. I'll say a little bit more about that. There's a free-form article that had long been thought to be archaic, but Anton Ingerson in his dissertation showed quite convincingly that this free-form becomes perfectly fine in current day Icelandic with certain types of adjectives that are intervening. So normally you get definiteness expressed by a suffix on the noun, but certain types of adjectives seem to block that suffixation process. And you get a free-form article hinum here, and that, sorry the glasses are a bit off, and that one, once you get it, only behaves like a weak article definite. In order to get anaphoric interpretations in that case, you need to resort to, again, the demonstrative adjective. Lithuanian, another fascinating case that Milena will tell us more about tomorrow, I believe. What's interesting here, again, formally, is that the definite marking, in this case, actually shows up on adjectives, and you can have the so-called short-form adjective that doesn't have it, that seems to act like the, among other things, like the weak article definites, and in the long form, where you have this definite marker present here, John is part there, that seems to act very much like the strong article definites. Okay, so again, this looks quite uniform in terms of the meaning contrast. Let's first reflect on variation in form here. I think the first very basic but important generalization that we need to consider in our analyses of these phenomena is that a more in meaning, right, this additional anaphoric element that plays a role there, very systematically corresponds to a more in form, right? So in German you find the reduced or contracted forms versus the non-contracted ones. In the full Germanic paradigms, I think one can basically argue in all of these cases that there is a systematic difference in the complexity of the forms involved. And of course, in the no versus avert cases, there's an obvious difference in complexity that systematically aligns with the weak article definites being expressed by bare forms, right? So never against the other. The cases of Icelandic and Lithuanian, I think, are particularly interesting in terms of the formal variation. The Lithuanian case, I'll actually not go through these in detail in the interest of time, but I think these are really important cases to understand in more detail just what formal reflexes we can find that indicate this distinction that we're talking about. So here are just some sort of general musings in terms of how to make sense of the form meaning mapping for all these cases across languages. I don't offer any conclusive answers here, but I think studying these sorts of languages and these types of contrasts informs a broader understanding of what noun phrase structure looks like in a variety of ways. So first of all, right, there's a number of key choice points in terms of what we do with the article contrast. The one I alluded to already, right, is this question, do we underline, we want to just start out with one meaning for a definite article after all and put all the variation in the structure, as on the Hanning proposal, or do we want to keep these separate, as separate lexical items? And there's another route to go, and I'll say a little bit about this type of analysis towards the end of the talk, that the definite article itself actually doesn't contribute any meaning of its own, it's just a mere signal of certain types of unambiguity. And if that doesn't make sense, wait till the end, hopefully it will make sense. So the case of bare NPs, right, as we saw on the list that we looked at least with regards to the languages we've studied so far, seems to make up a very substantial part of languages that have a particular form for expressing weak article definites in contrast to the strong article definites. Of course, with those, as we've already seen in some of the talks today, questions arise about what is the structure involved in those. Are these genuine bare NPs, or is there something more there? In these cases, of course, also the question of how the weak and strong article forms relate to one another is a particularly interesting one, since the overt contrast is quite stark in having something covert, perhaps, and something explicit. And then there's additional questions of theoretical relevance, whether the relevant bare noun phrases do have other interpretations, particularly indefinite ones. The big question that various people already have talked about is the question of whether or not we do want a D projection in the bare cases for these weak article definites. I think the article contrast cases in particular has some unique perspectives to add to that discussion. Based on how we analyze these different definite articles and the contrast between them should constrain the options that we have for the analysis of the bare NPs in general. And I think, at least to the extent that we want to make assumptions about type shifters being something that's quite universally available and uniformly available, or kind of always playing out in the same way, to the extent that we find actual variation in the meaning of bare NPs, that will also relate directly to the question of whether we want null B's positive there, because null type shifters presumably would give you that type of variation. Just to cite some very additional evidence here, I think by now it's clear that there are at least some languages that have bare forms to express weak definite articles, where the bare noun phrases also have uses as general and indefinite cases. I'm not presenting the data here today, but Akan, Lithuanian, and ASL, I think, are good candidates for making that sort of point. And at least on certain views that we already heard about today, we needed Ayal's general approach. In particular, if that is going on, I think turning her arguments kind of upside down, that actually would provide further evidence for positive null definite determinants in a variety of these cases. And as you'll see, I think when Milena will present the stuff on Lithuanian in more detail, that case, since the marking is not actually happening in the D projection itself, but on the additives, may involve a case where we have something like null strong determinants, something that we don't see otherwise. But they, of course, have a reflex elsewhere. Okay, so much for variation in form. Lots of important work to be done there, and I'm just trying to sort of lay out the land in terms of what we need to cover there. And now let's turn to the question of whether there's variation in meaning, and in terms of the way the meaning contrast between weak and strong article definites, in particular, pans out. So the data we've considered so far, partly by design, so to convince you that this is a very general cross-linguistic thing, did seem to exhibit a very uniform semantic contrast. But there is, of course, some variation in terms of how these contrasts play out. Some of it I would consider relatively minor, and not necessarily something that's actually incompatible with the general analysis that I propose. I'll go through a couple of these. There seems to be some variation in aphoric uses and sort of larger discourses. There's some variation with a particular type of situational uniqueness use, and also with the situational bridging. I think in all of those cases, there's at least the possibility for accounting for them in terms that leave the main semantic analysis of the contrast standing. But then we'll turn to the case of Haitian Creole, which exhibits really more substantial variation. Okay, so here's, unfortunately, I was unable to dig up the data on this because it's only existed in email exchanges back and forth with Anton. But there's sort of a minor piece of variation where quite commonly, both in, say, Fähring and in German, you might introduce in a larger narrative an individual with an indefinite and pick them up with a strong article definite. And at least in the cases where there's sort of a central character to the story, you might wind up then to, quite naturally, would switch to weak article definites further down the road. In Icelandic, interestingly, it seems like you would consistently hold on to using the strong form in those sorts of cases. But that, of course, is by no means inconsistent with the formal analysis, but it's sort of gives rise to an interesting question of why there should be this sort of pragmatic difference in the choice of how you carry on reference to the central characters in the story amongst two forms that are in principle available based on the semantics that they provide. Another interesting contrast noted by Lisa Matthewson and Ruby Arco in their paper on Akan is when you talk about things like the family dog, right? So you have very high familiarity with a particular unique individual here. In German, in the relevant context, which I'll let you read on your own, you would clearly use the weak article form for this sort of case. Interestingly, in Akan, you use the explicit strong familiarity article in that particular case. And it's possible, based on how I read Vespel, that something similar is happening in Norwegian Creole, but I don't have specific data on that. Again, we want to ask ourselves, does that mean something entirely different is going on for these sorts of cases? I think a reasonable case can be made that that is not necessarily so, right? Because after all, even other expressions, recall the index and the anaphoric definiteness really just works like a pronoun, and we have plenty of configurations or possible contexts where even a simple pronoun can work just fine without an explicit antecedent if the relevant referent is sufficiently salient in the, for the speaker and hearer. So, if you have a job and have an obnoxious boss whose activities you frequently report on, you might come home and say to your spouse, you know what he did today? Talking about your single kid in the same way, right? These things certainly work out, and one could simply describe the Akan case as doing the same thing with the strong article definite here. The question then again would be, why does it choose to do it that way and not the way that German does it? That is, of course, something that more needs to be said about. It might very likely relate to the situation that Akan has additional indefinite interpretations of the bare form, so there might be a sort of pragmatic reasoning about different types of forms that are available in the language that could bear on this. But this is by no means worked out. I think there's a possible path. Another interesting case that Vespel reports on the German dialect of Aman is that there seem to be languages that don't draw, they have a distinction between what looks like strong and weak articles in general terms, but as far as these bridging cases work out, that I focused on earlier, they happen to not draw a distinction there and use the strong article for both types of cases. So the illustration here in 16 shows you a case where you have these altars that are referred to as part of the church, standard German, or in the related examples would use the weak article, and the Aman case seems to use the strong article quite consistently here. There's a question as to exactly how we want to analyze this, but I think, again, we need to acknowledge that, in effect, the predicted distribution in terms of where these forms should, in principle, be available, based on the analysis that I put forth, does exhibit some substantial overlap, so that it may rather be a matter of choosing which form you want to use in a given language. There's, of course, again, the interesting question of where, what motivates that sort of variation, but it may not be sort of require a fundamental change in terms of the analysis. On a related note, there's various other languages. Faulkner reports on a couple of these where there's a lot of variation precisely with respect to these sorts of bridging cases. In Upper Sorbian, apparently, he found that there's sort of a generational divide, with older speakers not requiring an article in the comparable case like 17, my car, the motor. Older speakers are fine to leave the apparent strong article definite away there on motor, whereas younger speakers like to include it. But interestingly, the variation only applies to these types of examples and not to the what I've called the book author type cases. There, all of these languages seem to exhibit or use the correlate of the strong form. And furthermore, as far as I can tell, there aren't any languages that don't draw a bridging distinction. That's just sort of another aspect of what I just said, but use the weak article form for both. So it's not like it's sort of a free-for-all or a general number thing. It seems to be that these particular types of bridging cases do exhibit some general variation cross-linguistically. Again, we want to understand what that variation is, but it need not necessarily undermine, I think, the overall analysis. So I think there's at least some reasonable hope here that the basic semantics that I propose can be maintained for all of these cases, and the types of interesting questions that arise is that we're dealing with something that's essentially a pragmatic variation of sorts, which is an interesting thing that we need to study and understand better, but I think it's a way of supplementing the basic semantics in a way that could account for all of these. Okay, so turning to the much more problematic case of Haitian Creole. Here we have, just like in Aman, the dialect I just showed you, no contrast in the bridging cases, They all have the overt correlate, also La is also French-based Creole, of course. But in addition, they show systematically use of these La strong articles, or that we would suspect to be the correlate of the strong article, in all kinds of larger immediate situation uses, using Hawkins terminology here. And the only case where we really get a bare form is with what Westphal describes as complete functional descriptions. I'll show you what this looks like in just a moment. And then there's lots of very interesting things going on with La in the interaction of the domains that are set for things like only and superlatives. And I'll show you some data. So here, just the first quick illustration that Haitian Creole does not draw the bridging contrast and uses La in both cases. It's extremely parallel to what we've looked at before. Just notice that we have the church as part of the village, and the author, both of them use the appropriate form of the La in the language here. And then the only bare form that we find in this case is in these cases like Papa Marie, the father of Mary. This is not a possessive, but so it's additively paraphrased as the father of Mary, and here we don't find the La Marie. And then there's very interesting further cases I illustrated here with the examples involving only then shows where based on where you introduce a certain modifier, so in his family here, right? And Peter is the only boy in his family, you don't get the La in that case for the definite description here with the only. But if you move the in his family to the beginning, slight variation, so this family is big, but Peter is the only boy, which we still understand to be the only boy in his family, there we get the correlate of the La in that particular case, apparently in some way linking back to the English family in an interesting way. And Westphal discusses also possible relations to absolute versus relative interpretations, so this might be interesting for people working on these things to look into just exactly what's going on there. Now, as far as I can tell, if you line up the cases here where the La is used and where it's not used, there's just no way of making this directly relate to the article contrast as I analyze it. The global unique cases, things like the sun, also use La, and that just doesn't make any sense on the analysis I propose. So the question then is this really a fundamentally different contrast? And as an aside, right, both Haitian and Mauritian Creole are, of course, French-based Creole, and they both clearly use the La, but they use it very differently, so we want to understand how they relate to one another. And for now, I just want to give a brief sketch of an idea of how we might analyze the contrast in a quite alternative way. This is building essentially directly on what Westphal proposes. He frames it in the following way, that La indicates, in a certain situation framework that he uses, indicates the use of a resource situation variable. And one could easily reframe that in a sort of more explicit situation semantics like I used in my presentation by saying that La indicates that the situation pronoun does not correspond to the topic situation of the clause that appears in, basically. It could be either bound, higher up, or free. And perhaps what's going on in cases like Papa Marie, where you don't find the La, right, that in a certain sense, the Marie noun phrase here, and similarly in other examples, actually directly provides a value for the situation that we're interpreting the entire definite in, and therefore the La is not needed. Interestingly, on a related note, trying to link this to the direct reflexes of situations in the structure, we should also note that Haitian Creole also uses these same forms, it seems, on entire clauses. Oh, this is not what I want, actually. That's on the next page. Sorry. I'll skip over that in so there's a couple additional assumptions, and obviously there's a lot to be worked out here, but hopefully it give you a general sense of the direction that a possible analysis in sort of independent terms could give you. And if there's anything right about this type of approach, I think there's lots of more specific questions we need to ask about what range of intentional interpretations, theory or transparent interpretations, we find for the bare versus La cases in Haitian Creole, because if it's really linked to the presence of a particular type of interpretation of a situation pronoun, we should have some very concrete predictions there about how these things work out. Just as a general note, I think what's attractive about this type of analysis of the Haitian case is that it's actually allowing us to say something about how the Mauritian case and the Haitian case relate to one another, the strong and weak article contrast versus this contrast in Haitian more generally, namely that really both cases might involve something quite similar, but kind of at different levels. Very roughly speaking, right, that in the strong articles, as I discussed them, you have an anaphoric individual variable playing a crucial role, and perhaps what's going on in the Haitian is that we have some type of situation variable that's playing a crucial role, which gives you a slightly different type of range of options for a type of anaphoricity to situations at this other level. So this might be a way of trying to see them as somewhat similar, but yet sort of independently accountable. So if that worked out and we were done there, that might be all good and well then. So far we've seen some what I've called pragmatic variation, but otherwise a pretty uniform semantic contrast. And then this different contrast in Haitian Creole. And if that were all there was, I think maybe we would still be in reasonably good shape. But recent work on a number of numeral classifier languages of different sorts, including Bangla, which we'll hear about in the next days, and Jinyun by Andrew Simpson, and also work on Cantonese. These kind of seem to suggest that there's yet further and more subtle variation between the cases that may make it a little bit harder to keep track of things in completely separate terms. I'm not sure exactly how this will play out, but just to give you a sense of where this is going. They're like Aman and like Haitian Creole in that you don't find any contrast in terms of how the two types of bridging are expressed. But they furthermore sort of exhibit variation based on, in terms of what forms are used for different types, apparently different types of these sort of larger situation uses, based on perhaps whether you're making reference to things in a specific versus very general way. This has been discussed for Cantonese, and Melina started looking into it for Lithuanian, and Bangla may exhibit similar phenomena. So now, right, this seems to sort of fluctuate in terms of its behavior with respect to these cases from the other languages. And that suggests the question of whether, in the end, having all this data in front of us, we do need to acknowledge that there is perhaps just one spectrum and it's more gradient. That's a real possibility. And the question is, where do we go? Well, here's, I think, where it's just only fair to mention an analysis that proposes to do exactly that. Namely, work going back to Sebastian Löbner's paper in 1985. Recent work by Altman tries to spell this out further. This is based on this contrast between semantic and pragmatic uniqueness, where you get ambiguity based on the noun alone versus based on the context. That's sort of the basic distinction. And then this whole complex system of shifting the denotations of things from what they refer to as individual concepts and functional concepts. And certain types of shifts need to be marked, and that's the role of the different articles. So this crucially involves the assumption, where I already start to have my doubts, but I'll lay it out here, right, that there's a type distinction between sortal nouns like dog and stone, which are the standard type ET, and what they call individual nouns like son and prime minister, which are fundamentally of type E. Last piece of their story is the scale of uniqueness. That is, I'm just quoting here, basically defined according to the degree of invariance of reference of nominal expressions. That's how Ortmann puts it. So you start out with these sort of deictic sortal nouns on the one end and proper names at the other end, and then all kinds of fine-grained distinctions in the middle between other types of cases. Now, frankly, I don't have the time to go into it, but I think there's a number of conceptual issues we need to get clear on if we want to approach things from this angle. First of all, I have my doubts that the idea that there are really different semantic types involved in different cases is really that well motivated. There's some questions I have about exactly what this uniqueness scale, what is measured on that scale, and how we can put that in more precise formal terms. I think it's also problematic that there's no meaning contrast between the forms. These forms are merely sort of markers of a type shift sort of happening for the different semantic types. And I've also not seen a spelled out analysis of the covariation type of data. So there's lots of things. I'm not going to go through this case in detail, but just to give you a sense for why we might be worried to assume different types of, different semantic types for these sorts of nouns. I gave you the examples earlier with the case of minister, which should be a sortal noun in their terms, and therefore you need the strong article to shift to sort of a referential use. But it so turns out that you can perfectly well come up with manipulations of context indicated here, where you can get the weak article to work with nouns like minister perfectly well. And the question that I have then is, would you want a system where a change in context then requires you to assume that that will have as its result a change in the semantic types of the nouns that you're dealing with? To me, that seems somewhat questionable. Anyway, these are things I think we should worry about from this angle. One important feature of this type of account is that it predicts a lot of variation and a lot of fine-grained variation along this uniqueness scale. That basically the idea that, well, languages can vary in terms of where on that scale they decide to feel the need to indicate that some shift is happening. That's roughly how I understand it. The question then, of course, is, well, does variation actually fit on that scale? And is it as fine-grained as predicted? I think that on both of those counts, the analysis actually doesn't do so great. If you revisit the case of Haitian Creole, right, the difference between father of Mary, a complete functional description in their terms also, and these individual nouns like son, they differ in whether they come with a la or not, and it's not clear to me on this uniqueness scale type of approach why you would want to draw a line between these two cases. Why is one more or less invariant than the other in terms of achieving ambiguity? Further, right, the data with the only that I showed you from Haitian Creole, I think there's also nothing we have to say on this type of analysis of what the law does in those cases. And, you know, despite acknowledging that there are some more fine-grained cases of variation that we find that have gone through here, all in all, it's not the case that we find sort of across that whole big scale they present. We find, you know, one language making a cutoff point here and the next over here. It's not really making use of all these sorts of cutoffs. I think it sort of overpredicts the gradients of variation in that regard. So for all of these reasons, as far as I'm concerned at this point, if we do want to make the leap and say that we need to have a theoretical approach to have a more fine-grained account of variation along one dimension to account for these article contrasts across all these languages, then we're going to have to improve on this and find another way of spelling that out. I don't have anything to offer in that regard, and I think the jury is still out based in terms of whether we might not be able to work things out in terms of dealing with them as orthogonal contrast, perhaps in a somewhat related way. Okay, so let me come to close here. So we find very, very related, and in many cases seemingly identical article contrast across many languages, quite uniform in line with the analysis I proposed. And this has lots of implications for our understanding of noun structure, definite varieties, and so on. In general, so we should consider all this cross-linguistic data on the contrast in particular in this regard. There is this additional variation, again, which may require an orthogonal account or some other story that we haven't worked on yet. And of course, there's lots and lots of more languages to look at that exhibit interesting related particle phenomena. We have stumbled with some purpose, but of course not quite across the whole board here, and there's lots more that we need to look at. The good news is that both we now, I think, are both in a position that we have quite a good and useful set of tools to actually study these sorts of issues much more extensively across languages, and really are starting to have a quite good understanding of what variation there is and how the cross-linguistic picture actually looks like. And of course, we're very excited to see the fruit of these sorts of endeavors in many of the talks at this workshop. So this is great fun, and I look forward to learning much more about all these different cases. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a really nice range of data to think about. Several times you said things that sounded like you were talking about implicational universals, but you didn't quite frame them that way. When you mention a uneven scale, you seem to be implicitly suggesting such a thing. So one that you seem to state almost explicitly was if a language has a weak, strong, definite distinction, then the anaphoric one is the more marked one, so you're explicit about that.
Yeah.
There seems to be a slightly more implicit one that if a language marks the bridging cases as strong, then it will mark the purely anaphoric cases as strong. So you didn't make that explicit, but I expect your scale would bring that out. If we, so I'm
well, that's not my scale, so.
Okay, but let me ask whether, so there are various cases, there's relational nouns, there's situational uniqueness, so if you were to arrange them, maybe temporarily putting the Haitian case to one side, if you were to arrange them, what sort of orderings do you observe in terms of implicational universals or in terms of a scale?
Well, I think the one, so putting Haitian Creole aside, I think the one most systematic case where we do find this shift back and forth is precisely in these cases of whether or not the part-whole type bridging uses the strong article or not. That, in the data that I've seen so far, seems to be the one place where there's back and forth.
So part-whole.
So
so
the village, the church.
If part-whole is marked. Sorry, how does it go? Does it go if situational uniquenesses, or if bridging is marked in general this way, then part-whole is, or does it go the other way? Maybe it goes the other way.
So the book author type cases always use the strong article correlate. The church, tower, or village church type situational part-whole type of cases, situational cases, as I would frame them. Those across languages seem to vary. In German and all these other cases, they use the weak article, but then there's this case of Alman, and perhaps the Upper Sorbian and so on, where there's some fluctuation or perhaps even a change that would be interesting to find out more about. But the change there seems to be in the direction of no article to having an article for that particular case. That was the car motor case for Sorbia. Yeah, so that's kind of it's relatively confined, the variation there, and it's not unordered and all over the board, but in that, yeah. Yeah.
I have a question with respect to your slide 39.
Okay.
This is a slide where you consider whether you're finding evidence for null Ds and Ps
Yeah.
data. I was wanting to ask a follow-up question about this because I want to understand your argumentation a little bit better. And here I'm wondering both about the second major bullet point and about the third major bullet point. So it seems like the issue of variation in bare NP interpretations could simply follow in some of the languages that you discussed just from competition between bare NPs and marked forms, which exists. So for instance, in a con, if you chose not to use the marked form, then there's some kind of implication that comes out of that. So I'm not sure that I see that there's an argument for null Ds there. And then if I look at your third bullet point, though, the idea here is that there is a genuine ambiguity for bare nouns in some languages, and that suggests null definite Ds exist. Here, it sounds like you're appealing to competition. You're saying null definite Ds exist, so that takes the type shift off the table, so you get an indefinite reading. I hope that you can clarify the reason.
Yeah, right, yeah, sorry that this wasn't that clear. This has basically been cut down from a previous talk. It's very condensed, so I'm not surprised that it was somewhat unclear. Sorry about that. No, it's really kind of responding very directly to the Dayal type picture, where you have, right, so if you take the Dayal argument to be that, well, look at Hindi, people have said that the bare forms are ambiguous between definite and indefinite. No, if you look closer, there are no genuine indefinite readings, and then it fits nicely into this whole picture where all of that comes about by type shifters, not null D heads, and the actual genuine quantificational existential readings are out because of the ranking of the type shifters, right? Turning that argument upside down, if it is true, and I think we need more data to really conclude that from me, that in some of these languages, the pair forms can have generally quantificational existential interpretations, and we furthermore want to maintain the assumption of the ranking between the type structures. There's a lot of assumptions in order for that conclusion to be warranted here. Then in these cases, I think would argue that, at least here, maybe she's right about Hindi and other cases, right? But at least for those sorts of cases, if we keep all those assumptions in place, I think then we would want to say that, well, how can they have a different interpretation if the type shifting is restricted in the ways we assume? Well, perhaps because we do have nullties that wind up bringing about the interpretations here. It would be, a further complication, but, I would look at the cross-linguistic picture, and if these are really general indefinites with being able to take wide scope and so on, which, again, I want to stress, we still need to really determine. If that's the case, then I don't see how we will need to capture the difference from Hindi in some way, and no, these seem to be a straightforward way of doing that. Does that clarify the line of argument?
Yeah, thank you. And then can you also explain also about the variation and variability interpretation supporting nullities?
Well, it's kind of the same, but it's not, again, yeah, it's not, so variation of the sort that I identified explicitly. Yeah, those are not separate points.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Bert.
Just adding to the variation, at least in some descriptive literature, people claim that there are not only hard languages that have definiteness contrast, but that have a specificity contrast. Have you looked at those? Like examples would be Samoan, Maori, things like that. How do they fit in?
Yeah, I have not looked at those. I think those would be very interesting to consider in similar ways. I mean, the perhaps obvious tempting thing to do there theoretically is to say, oh, you find the same index and it just sort of gets paired with an indefinite. I have no idea whether that's a viable approach, but yeah, no, I agree that that would be an interesting thing to look at. I don't know if you thought about what's going on in those cases. I haven't really had my hands full with all this mess, so should be done.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are finished for today. See you tomorrow at Colegio in México, not here. Just one note, the transportation only covers the morning shift, so you have to manage the case safely.
By the morning.
Not the invited speakers. And in the map that we gave you with the back, there is a mark that says Metrobus, Metrobus, and then it goes all along to Insurgentes. So the people who are staying in the Diplomático can take the Metrobus. Well, some of them can go with the invited speakers, but there are a lot of them, and they won't be in the car. If you're going somewhere like Loyo or anything else, you can take the Metrobus and just take it to the north and well, just check them out and see what's convenient for you. The other thing you can do if you're going to Coordinación is walk, I don't have a map, but I'll explain you outside, to the metro, to the subway, and then take the subway to Coordinación. And for the Metrobus, you have to buy a card. It's like a card, it's like a Oyster card, so there are no tickets, so you really need to. So that's it. And sorry, one more thing. Bring this tomorrow because in the Olympics there are horrible in the entrance, and so it's going to be a messy event. Oh yeah, on the not very beautiful thing to say, but tomorrow please stay in the morning because